Welcome to the first in a series of videos in which I will be explaining what is liberalism. My name is Farhat Amin. I'm a high school teacher and a podcaster. In my podcast, A Muslim Mum Podcast, I cover topics such as secularism and feminism and the effect on the Muslim community. I've also helped to deliver and organise a popular course in the UK called The Thinking Muslim Guide to Liberalism. Why do you need to understand liberalism? Liberalism is the most influential ideology in the world today. It's been adopted by American and European governments. Liberal ideas have become the epitome of good, and any alternative ideas are seen as backward. Islam does have an alternative set of ideas about what is good for the individual and society. What we can see nowadays is that liberals are aggressively promoting liberal ideas to Muslims in the West and in the East, and they're surprised and quite hostile to us when we don't adopt it as a way of life. Our religious texts such as the Quran and Hadith are criticised, and we are being told nowadays to reinterpret it so that it adapts to the modern world. Similar to the Reformation that happened to Christianity, that's what is being asked of Islam today. Long Beach State University scholar Yusuf Baker said Muslims are the quintessentially illiberal subjects. He's speaking in a US context, and he's saying that US citizens who are Muslim, they have not adopted liberal values wholeheartedly, and for him that's a problem. Another example of an aggressive liberal is Bill Maher. He's a US comedian who has his own talk show, and he regularly criticises Islam for not being progressive and holding really backward ideas. Let's look at a few clips from his show.
But it speaks volumes about why liberal Western culture is not just different, it's better. To count yourself as a liberal, you have to stand up for liberal principles, free speech, separation of church and state. Freedom to practice any religion or no religion without the threat of violence. Respect for minorities, including homosexuals, equality for women. Still about this concept.
It's gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so nuts.
It's like saying those stateless, shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
You guys are saying if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles like freedom of speech, like we are endowed by our forefathers with an inalienable rights, like all men are created equal.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the mother lode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's
ideas
just a fact.
like blasphemy.
It's the only religion that acts like the mafia that fucking kill you if you say the wrong thing, draw the wrong picture, or write the wrong book.
So that was Bill Maher. In an interview, he defended what he said, and he continued by saying, I think Sam Harris, the man who was sitting next to him, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is an ex-Muslim who lives in US, and Salman Rushdie, who wrote the book Satanic Verses, which ridiculed the Prophet, peace be upon him. So he's saying these are the people that he thinks are good, and he's saying that they're basically making the same point. I think we all feel frustrated because I think we feel like the people who are arguing with us are not listening. We are not bigoted people, although I think everyone would agree he sounded like a bigot. On the contrary, we are trying to stand up for the principles of liberalism. And so, I think we're just saying we need to identify illiberalism. So he's identifying it in the Muslims, wherever we find it in the world, and not forgive it. Now that's what I find interesting. What does he mean by not forgive it? So does that mean they should go to our countries and force people to take on board these ideas? If they don't, is it okay to invade countries like Iraq and try to make them liberal? So that was just one example to illustrate what I meant by the aggressive liberals that exist today. So how should we address these criticisms? Firstly, what we can see is that Muslims have responded to these ideas in one of two ways. Either they embrace it, so Salman Rushdie, Ayana Hirsi, they have embraced it, or we have others who refashion Islam as a result of it. So they want to reform and change Islam to fit into the liberal paradigm. So you have organisations such as the Progressive Muslim Alliance in America. There are many more that they will do things like say it's okay for women to be imams, to lead mixed prayers. They propagate feminist ideas and say that that's acceptable within Islam. Now, based on the discussions we're going to have in this video and the next, I'm going to explain why I think those two approaches are incorrect. What I believe is our duty is not to be defined by liberalism, and many Muslims think this and its thoughts, but rather we are defined by the deen revealed by Allah. Secondly, it's important to effectively build a counter-argument and a counter-narrative based on Islam and its teachings. But before that can be done, we have to take the time and effort, and this is one reason why producing this video, and also why we have been doing the Thinking Muslim course, is to do exactly that. First, understand exactly what liberalism is. And finally, we can see that after 9/11, policymakers have dispensed with the old policies of multiculturalism, where everyone's culture was accepted and seen as everyone has a right to have different views, cultures, ideas, values, and they can practice them. That has now been scrapped, and there's a muscular liberalism. That was the term coined by the ex-Prime Minister of UK, David Cameron, and what him and others are now saying is Muslims have to concede to liberalism in return for acceptance. You may have seen this book or heard of this book. It's called The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, and he wrote this after the Cold War ended, so when communism was defeated in the USSR and capitalism was seen as being the dominant ideology that was being adopted by all over the world. So what Fukuyama said was, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, that is, the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So there is no better idea that humans can think of. There is no alternative to Western liberalism. And so he wrote this book. But many people have disagreed with him since he's written that. So let's now understand from its core beliefs, what is liberalism? Who are the founding fathers? What are the ideas that they were proselytizing? And did they actually live by the ideas that they came up with? So we now have, you can see this is a picture of Martin Luther. The roots of liberalism lie in the Reformation, a 15th and 16th century European religious movement led by Martin Luther. He argued that individuals seeking to communicate with God did not need to rely on popes and priests who had corrupted Catholicism. Luther argued that Christianity could assume a more individualistic character, with believers undertaking their own private prayers and undertaking God's work in their own way. He was the founder of Protestant Christianity. I'm going to show you a clip which runs through the brief history of the Reformation and its impact in Europe.
The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century shook the very foundation of Europe's cultural identity. The Reformation was a revolution of religion in Western Europe. Essentially, it was the result of centuries' worth of political and social grievances against the Christian Church as it existed. Christianity, which began as a fledgling religion in the 1st century, had grown by the 13th century into an institution powerful enough to rival state governments. For instance, the Pope, then the leader of the Christian Church, had greater political and military influence than some emperors and kings. This tension was exacerbated by the transformative social and intellectual period known as the Renaissance. In particular, this period involved the rise of humanism, a philosophy that shifted man's fate from being determined by religious doctrine to being determined by man himself. Additionally, some within the church believed it had become increasingly corrupt. Priests like John Wycliffe of England and Jan Hus of Bohemia challenged the church's teachings, which they believed had strayed away from the Bible. However, one of the most well-known advocates for a reformed Christian church was a German priest named Martin Luther. Martin Luther began to question the church in the early 1500s. He believed it was abusing its power and disagreed with some of its practices. For instance, he challenged the church's doctrine that stated the Pope, not the Bible, was the ultimate spiritual authority. Plus, he criticized the church for selling indulgences, the practice of purchasing forgiveness for one's sins by giving money to the church. Luther believed the church needed to revise its doctrine by returning to the Bible's teachings and by saying that salvation could be granted by faith in Christ alone. So on October 31st, 1517, Luther took a stand. In what's considered the birth of the Protestant Reformation, Luther is said to have nailed 95 theses, or arguments against the church, onto the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther was later put on trial in front of church officials to defend his theses, but in January 1521, the church declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. While Luther's membership with the church ended, the Reformation he argued for started to gain momentum. Unlike Luther's predecessors who challenged the church, Luther had one tool at his disposal that they didn't have: the printing press. This new invention allowed his arguments to be copied and spread across Europe. This unprecedented access to ideas such as Luther's inspired many others to challenge the church, thereby splitting Christianity into two major denominations, Catholic and Protestant, from the word protest. Also, the Bible became more accessible. Luther and other reformists translated biblical text from Latin, which was only known by nobility and church officials, to German, English, and French, languages spoken by the general public. While the Protestant Reformation revolutionized the Christian faith, it had ramifications that extended beyond religion. Prior to the Reformation, many Europeans were dependent on an educated upper class. But perhaps the most resounding impact of the Reformation was that the common people were empowered to question religion and other aspects of life. The Reformation, along with technological innovations and the introduction of other new ideas, gave many in Europe's general public the freedom and power to decide their own fates.
That video was taken from the History Channel. So we can see that after the Renaissance and Reformation, what happened next was the Enlightenment. Now that extended these religious ideas into the political and secular affairs. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emerged in the 16th century. It was a belief in reason rather than faith, promoted debate, inquiry, and questioned religious beliefs. This then led to the idea of secularism, which is to keep religion to the periphery of your life. You know, for example, a secular government is independent of religion. If you are then a secular person, religion doesn't inform your daily decisions. As far as your personal religious beliefs, that's okay, and festivals, marriage, births and deaths, that is perfectly fine, but as far as politics, economics, religion should not have a say in those matters. some of the radical ideas of the Enlightenment, and they were radical because they had never been thought of or questioned or acted upon previously, were that each individual has free will. Individuals are now the best judge of their own interests. An individual's life should be shaped by their actions and decisions, and monarchs do not have to be instinctively obeyed by subjects. Let's now turn our attention to John Locke. He was the father of liberalism, a 17th century English philosopher and a Protestant. He was one of the first to explain the basic ideas of liberalism. He also wrote papers on tolerance, where he called about the neutral state. I'll speak about that in another session. Now, his works and ideas inspired Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, but also the French and American revolutions. He said man had natural rights to defend his life, health, liberty, and possessions. According to Locke, the state was not part of God's creation. Monarchs did not have the divine right to govern, and human beings are rational and should create by themselves a political system based on reason. He rejected the idea of original sin, that's a Christian idea, and human nature has the ability to bring about progress. Individuals are guided by reason and rationalism and are able to calculate answers to life's problems. And again, the natural rights were life, everyone is entitled to live. Liberty, everyone is entitled to anything they want to, so long as it doesn't conflict with the first right. And estate, meaning property, everyone is entitled to own all they create or gain through gift or trade, so long as it doesn't conflict with the first two rights. You can read his books if you want to get details, but that's a brief summary of the ideas that he came up with, and they were adopted by the people involved in the French Revolution and the American Revolution. So as you may have noticed, the individual kept coming up in the discussions that he had, and so this idea of individualism first came about here during this period, and it's a vital principle of liberal thinking. It means an individual's needs should be at the heart of political thought, economic life, and social organisation. Society should prioritise the improvement of diverse individual lives. So having read all of that, it's then quite surprising to find out that John Locke was a slave owner. Given his reputation as a defender of property rights and personal freedom, Locke has been accused of hypocrisy for his role in promoting and benefiting from slavery and the expropriation of indigenous populations. So it seems that if you were a European Protestant, then Locke felt you deserved to have those rights. But for example, indigenous people, atheists were seen as, no, you don't deserve to have these rights either. So it doesn't, here we can see one of the contradictions of liberalism. Another example is Thomas Jefferson. Whilst writing the line, "All men are born equal" in the Declaration of Independence of America, he was being waited on by his black slave. Records show he kept as many as 130 slaves on his Monticello plantation, and in his lifetime he owned 600 slaves. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence did not extend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to African Americans, Native Americans, indentured servants, or women. So again, here is an example of a contradiction with what they say they believe, but when it comes to practice, they did something completely opposite. This is why a prevalent reaction has been to assert that the champions of those revolutionary ideals were hypocrites, including 12 of the first 18 American presidents who were slave owners. And again, I would recommend that you research this for yourself. It's all recorded. So, in conclusion then, you can say that liberalism describes the European or Western ideology and has perspectives on the following areas: human nature, society, the state and government, the economy, and international relations. And I will be covering these 4 topics in future videos. What we can also now say is Islam also has a clear perspective on all these topics as well. Islam provides a counter-narrative to liberalism. That is, and that's what we will be looking at. Muslims do not need to follow liberal ideas, automatically. We shouldn't feel we have to do that. We believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us clarity of thinking that helps us achieve success in this life, but also prepares us for the real life in Jannah, which is eternal. As I mentioned, in future sessions I will discuss the other topics. Just to let you know, if you'd like to listen to the podcast I have, it's available on Apple Podcasts and other apps. And also the Thinking Muslim Guide to Liberalism course, we will be doing future courses soon. And so if you'd like to stay informed of that, please send me an email, info@farhatamin.com. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so you can stay updated when the next video comes out.